The king was trying to intimidate. The king was trying to coerce. But they refused to bow. We need a faith that is not going to bow to intimidation. When times are tough, when times are insecure, people will try to manipulate us. People will try to intimidate us in order to get their way, in order to have power over us, in order to control us in some way. Maybe they'll threaten us that if you don't do this, you'll lose your job. Or they'll threaten us that they'll destroy us economically, or they threaten a smear campaign. But we should not compromise our integrity. We should not compromise our integrity as others may try to intimidate in order for them to get their way. But we must stand strong. A second thing that I want you to see about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was that they had a faith that stood even in the face of reality. Verse 17 begins, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood the reality of the situation. They understood that if they didn't bow, the reality was they would be thrown into the furnace. But even given the reality of being thrown into the furnace, even facing the reality, the gravity of the situation, they refused to bow, but they stood firm in their faith. Now there's a difference between bullheadedness, wanting to get your own way, and standing firm in the face of adversity. It's important for us to examine our motives. Are we doing something, are we digging in our heels simply in order to get our own way, what we want, or are we doing this because of our convictions? Are we doing this because of our desire to hold firm in our faith? Even if the reality is that it will cost us something, we should hold firm in our faith. Maybe it will cost us a letter grade. I remember back when I was in college that there were some professors that were sharing some things that were their opinions that I didn't agree with, but yet at that point I wasn't strong enough to stand up against them and debate them. I would just write back for them on the test whatever it was that they wanted to hear in order for me to get a good grade. Because I was afraid that if I challenged them, if I didn't say what they wanted me to say, then I would suffer and not get as good a grade as I might get otherwise. Sometimes standing up in the face of reality may mean that it'll cost you a sale. Maybe it will mean that it will cost you a job. Remember, oftentimes in the Bible, God did not act. God did not make a way when there seemed to be no way until the person stood up and acted in faith. Reality faith recognizes that we may go through fire, but it takes a stronger faith to go through fire standing than it takes to escape a fire altogether. The third thing I want you to notice about their faith is that they had a faith that God would deliver them. Verse 17, they said, the God we serve is able to save us and will rescue us from your hand. There's a difference between the furnace and the hand of the enemy. What Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believed was that their God could deliver them from the furnace. But even if he didn't deliver them from the furnace, he would deliver them from the enemy. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego chose to trust God because they knew that he was able to do whatever needed to be done. And they could count on him for the results. I want you to notice one more thing about their faith. They were committed to God regardless of the outcome. Verse 18 said, but even if he does not deliver us, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Many people put conditions on God. They say, God, if you'll deliver me from this situation, then I'll follow you. Or, Lord, if you heal me then I'll be your disciple. We put these conditions that, God, if you do this, then I'll do that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't do that at all. They said, Lord, we're going to stand for you. We're going to be with you. We're going to seek to be faithful no matter what the results are. Even if it means being thrown in the furnace, even if it means death, we're going to stand faithful. Because of the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the story goes on that the king was furious with them. The king was furious with them and told them to heat up the furnace 7 times hotter than it had ever been heated before. And he took some of the strongest men and had them bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. In verse 21, so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men who were tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. All of Nebuchadnezzar's officials saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire upon them. And then once again Nebuchadnezzar brings praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I find it interesting and even characteristic of Nebuchadnezzar. It says that he threatens to kill anyone who will challenge against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as if their God needed Nebuchadnezzar's help. But it's an issue that God made a way for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when there seemed to be no way. They stood up in faith. They stood up in faith and God delivered them. In the process, God was praised. Nebuchadnezzar praised God. He invited others to praise and worship their God. When we stand up in faith, one of the things that happens is it causes God to be honored. It causes God to be worshiped. So often when taking a stand for our faith, I think that we examine our options. Before we stand up in faith, we weigh the consequences. What is it going to cost me to stand up in faith? How is this going to affect me if I take a stand for my faith? But here we see that in them taking a stand for their faith and in doing what was right, it brought praise to God's name, and it also brought blessing for them. As a result of them standing strong, it says that the King Nebuchadnezzar gave them an advancement. He gave them more responsibility in his kingdom. Well, as I read this story, it's kind of one of those, and they lived happily ever after endings. But it doesn't always happen like that.